Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this online version of Russia Talk. It's a new adventure for us all. Thank you for attending. Before I introduce the first panel session this morning, let me add my thanks to those which Alf has already expressed to our sponsors, and I'll read them if I may. Ian Plus and Norn Nickel, who are Platinum sponsors. Our gold sponsors are Greco, BP, Raven Russia, Synergy and Vitol. Our silver sponsors, AstraZeneca and EM. Our bronze sponsors, Accelerate, Tinkoff and TMI. On behalf of the board of the RBCC, I thank them greatly for being involved in this Russia Talk. And I thank you all, of course, for staying with us as members through this extremely difficult period. I'd also like to thank all of our panelists today for finding ways to deal with the restrictions of the pandemic and join us. And of course, I'd like to thank our executives teams led by Alf Torrance, who's now based in Moscow, and our teams in London and indeed in Moscow. Our first session today is on environment, sustainability and governance, and it's moderated by Sergei Brilov. Sergei, as you all will know, is the anchor for the Russian television station Rossiya, and he is also president of the Global Energy Association. I'll come back to you later today, but in the meantime, Sergei, I hand over to you for our first session. Sergei.
No, thank you. I mean, I think you've all seen, I think many of us have seen, I've heard many comments, I've talked to many partners in Russia and out about BP's new strategy. And so, on August 4th, as you all have seen, BP launched its new strategy, really putting ESG and sustainability at the core of what we do. And I think that is a huge reflection of the climate, no pun intended there, in which we are operating in these days. We hear from our investors, from governments and policymakers, from NGOs and from our own employees that we need to look at sustainability and really embed it in the business that we are putting forward. So Bernard launched on August 4th our strategy, which has been underpinned by our sustainability framework. And part of that strategy also, which I think people need to really think about and recognize, is that hydrocarbons will play an important part of our business for the next decades to come. He's been very clear that resilient focused hydrocarbons, and I look at our business in Russia and our partnership with Rosneft as a very important part of that strategy. BP is responding to what we believe is our purpose and really embedding our purpose to look at people and our planet and take our operations in a more sustainable path forward. So when we talk about that, it is absolutely, this is the largest and most significant transformation BP's had in 111 years. So we are serious about this, but we're not trading one for the other. Hydrocarbons remain a foundational part of what we do, and we believe, especially in the growing economies and emerging markets, that both hydrocarbons and renewables will play an important role. And we've committed ourselves to a net zero journey by 2050. And we are now looking at being an integrated energy company, and with that comes all sorts of energy. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I reflect on my own career. When I started with BP more than 12 years ago, hydrogen was absolutely a part of our portfolio then. I remember talking to policymakers across the globe about the merits of hydrogen. And, given our reset of our strategy on August 4th, hydrogen features very clearly in that strategy. In the reinvention of our company, we've created a hydrogen and CCUS division that will look at the merits of hydrogen and how we can develop and produce it over time. I do believe in hydrogen. I think natural gas will also continue to play a significant role in how we get through the transition, displacing coal specifically. And I do think hydrogen will continue to feature, and you're seeing it in Russia, you're seeing it in Europe. The attention that we're seeing and the investment that people are starting to make in really understanding how to get hydrogen at a scalable rate is clear. And I think you will continue to see hydrogen feature in the long term as we look towards the transition.
Pavel Yakushev, we met yesterday at the British ambassador's residence here in Sofiyskaya Nabережная, just yards away from where Stalin and Churchill were chatting 75 years ago, which is always a tiresome experience of sorts. Strangely enough, by the way, I was approached by the British Embassy a couple of years ago in order to find a photo which was surely taken during the encounter there, and it's nowhere to be seen. It's just disappeared in the archives. So let's compensate it by having a proper conversation about the ESG. I should switch into Russian because we had a preliminary agreement with Pavel. Pavel.
Sergey,
yes, yes.
Please, can you flick your language tab to either English or Russian as you speak?
That's what I've done. But I'm going to be switching languages.
Okay.
So
thanks.
what do I do? I'm now on the English channel, but if I speak Russian, so you mean
speaking Russian? Yes, that's
me?
great. Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
There was a problem.
Thanks. Pavel, мы вчера с вами встретились.
Pavel, yesterday we met and
любопытный поворот.
discussed
Все за.
a very interesting turnover.
Но есть ощущение в некоторых бизнес-кругах, что это может заменить нормальную бизнес-политику. Бизнес, он про деньги, ESG про настроение. Великая вещь, но все-таки где вы в этой дилемме?
So, what's the way out of this dilemma? Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Yes, it is true that yesterday we slightly touched upon the theme, but I believe that, Sergey, the ESG as a notion is much broader. And so when yesterday we were talking about the application of the renewables as compared against the gas generation, and generally speaking, how much should it cost for a company which is in the power generation traditionally. And so indeed, if we today look at Russia, it is quite cumbersome to set up a business case, as they say, when you compare the renewables against the very same gas generation. But nevertheless, we do see that these kinds of projects in Russia are being developed, and we do see the companies, for example, which invest into the solar power generation, but they apply it in a form of a hybrid solution, amongst other things, when we're saying that it moves abreast with the gas and sometimes, regrettably, with the diesel generation. So the proper way to phrase the question will be, what is more effective? What kind of a solution is more effective? It doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to put up a windmill or a solar panel, because sometimes it could be about setting up a much more effective generation about businesses, which will be burning less of the very same diesel fuel, or would emit less into the air. And that is something that we are quite scrupulously looking into and working on some of the projects which are going through the starting phase. And as you correctly noted, it is not always easy to alter the approaches that have been established, but the environmental protection, the ecology, are the topics that are in the priority list of the businesses and the government, and that becomes a cornerstone whenever we talk about new projects right now, including our customers, that apart from providing for an economic efficiency, we similarly offer a high level of services and standards, but nevertheless beyond what kind of an impact it creates upon the ecology and the societies where we operate.
Павел, экология,
Pavel,
устойчивое
ecology,
развитие,
sustainable development,
гражданский взгляд на бизнес. Был еще недавно в России чем-то таким, что печаталось на
recently in Russia, it
23-26
was
странице
something that you would
газеты.
find only on a 23rd or 24th page of
Сейчас
any
это
publication of
потихонечку
a
вдруг
newspaper.
вылезает на
Little by
первую
little,
страницу.
somehow, it all
Это
appears
особенно
now
чувствуется в
as an
молодежи,
editorial.
которые
Particularly you
реально
see
об этом
that
думают.
in the young generation minds.
Что
Think
движет
about
вами,
it.
когда вы
What
исходите,
propels you
применяете ESG в России?
when you think and work the
Господствующие
ESG
уже
way in
такие
Russia?
общественные настроения
Is it
на Западе
the
и часто в
prevalent
Британии?
attitudes, particularly in the West,
Начали ли
particularly in
вы
the
делать это
UK?
раньше, чем
Did
такие
you
настроения появились в
start doing
России?
it?
Или вы чувствуете все
Have you started
больше
doing it before
потребность
than
россиян
everybody
в
else?
такой
Or is it that you feel that the Russians really need it? A very proper observation, Sergei. Yes, indeed. ESG as an agenda item has started appearing very much often in Russia, but we as a UK company in our practical work and in all of our designs for the project, our customers do view these rules and approaches have applied from the very first time we started working in Russia since 2008. And you are correct. In the past, it was something that was considered as a standard thing in a business, and the businesses would always follow it. But currently, it has taken on this truncated, form of an ESG, being spun off into a whole separate thing. And actually, on a global footing, we also have such a strategy and policy which is being developed and soon will be disclosed to the market. But here we are always emphasizing that whatever we've been doing in the fields with our customers in the communities where we've been operating not always followed the kind of standards that have been written and continuously being perfected inside the company, despite the fact that maybe some sort of a local legislation would not require it. But this is something that we see and we feel, and even whenever we recruit new people, we see that people ask for it, because whenever they come to work for a company, then in case the company, the future potential employer, does follow these particular principles whenever they work.
Is an advantage of Zoom conference. I was watching Andrei Bogrov when you were referring to the subjects of regional legislation, and he started drinking water nervously. I'll come back to that issue a bit later. But Mark, if I may ask, have you been able to manage that technical problem? Can you now hear the English translation?
I can indeed. I can.
Lovely. Okay, so it's all set. I'm then going to address you. You are, of course, the longest-serving energy minister in the UK history.
Well,
I remember vividly. Well, you were, but I remember vividly interviewing your boss in that very embassy, David Cameron. asking him a question, is there a positive agenda between Russia and the UK, to which he said, of course, after which we didn't have quite a substantial conversation. But let's hope for the best. Tell me something. Now, the ESG approach emerged in the West and in Britain in particular years ago. It's only now coming to Russia in a serious form. What's the golden rule, if I may say so, in the relationship between the government, elected of course by the people who demand this, and the businesses who are not necessarily eager to adopt such policies?
Well, I think you have to recognize this isn't just coming from government. There's a very, very strong push from investors now on the ESG agenda, and that is being driven by the imperative of decarbonizing the economy. From investors' point of view, I think there is an increasing recognition and that actually if your investments, the companies you're invested in, aren't fundamentally sustainable from an environmental point of view, they're not sustainable from an economic or financial point of view. And while some of the metrics for ESG could be described as slightly subjective, or a critic might say would be woolly, when it comes to carbon, it's very clear, it's very scientific. You can audit your carbon footprint, and there are very clear science-based targets that companies and whole economies have to meet in order to keep on track with the commitments that were made by practically every country in the world at the Paris Climate Agreement. So there is this overarching, I think, recognition that unless the companies you're invested in have a very clear strategy to become part of the low carbon economy, they are going to be left behind, and investors will be left with what are widely known as stranded assets. So, and that's a real imperative. And while in many cases companies are setting out a course of action that will unfold over decades, until I think a lot of investors are looking forward to 2030, looking at what the world is going to look like in 2030 and pricing in 2030 values in today's stock prices. And that is having a massive impact. And of course, on top of that, you've got regulation in a whole range of countries like the UK, where you have carbon pricing in various forms, and regulation as well. For example, in the UK, we've announced that we will ban combustion engines from 2032, and it's widely expected that will come forward to 2030. And that has profound implications on manufacturing as well as consumer habits. So yes, there's a combination of public policy, there is pressure from civil society, particularly from young people, but there's also very real pressure from investors and financiers, and this is creating an unstoppable momentum.
Are we being completely honest here? I've been reading all those newspaper articles at the height of pandemic, the first wave at least, in such different publications, diverse, sometimes opposing publications as The Guardian and the Financial Times, and even the China Daily, about substituting carbon with the renewables. But then when you read it and you analyze it, you sometimes, occasionally, come to a conclusion that the whole thing is not about the climate change or the desire of businesses to keep this planet clean, but rather about redistributing government subsidies.
I don't think so. I mean, if you look at the UK, for example, we have gone from a near standing start. When I became climate change minister in 2010, very small percentage of UK energy came from renewable sources. Now, something like typically 45%, we've decarbonised by 45%, and the majority of UK energy is coming from clean sources. It's an extraordinary success story, but what's most impressive, it's now happening with little or no subsidy, not just in the UK, but right the way around the world. If you look at the solar auctions in India, which is outcompeting every other form of generation. If you look at the latest offshore wind auctions in the UK, you're seeing offshore wind coming in at nearly half the price of nuclear. It's absolutely extraordinary. And then if you look at other, wind in the US, onshore wind in the US, again, another very price competitive form of electricity. And I think the reason that you're seeing this snowball effect of renewables and the willingness of governments to commit to this agenda is because there has been this dramatic price fall in the cost of clean energy. But one of the most reliable, perhaps the most reliable source of clean electricity is actually that which we've been generating here in Russia for decades, extremely successful, and that's hydropower. And that, that is, has already had decades and decades of successful, reliable, dependable, clean electricity generation. But I think there's a big future ahead for hydropower, particularly as a partner to a low carbon grid that requires not just intermittent renewables, but dependable baseload supply as well.
Andrei, we've just put you and I in a peculiar position. The organizers have asked me to stick into English, so there's no problem with the translation. So as a true Russian man, I'm going to ask you in English a difficult question.
Oh, please, by all means.
Where are you? Where were you? And where are you after the spill?
Well, I was in Moscow before the spill. We traveled extensively to the Norilsk area after the spill, and I'm going to travel there this coming Sunday. But the good news is that 90% of the fuel that has been spilled has been collected. We also collected all the mixture of fuel and water and separated it on shore. Now the next challenge is for the coming years to restore the biosystem of the region and then remediate the land. That would, again, take some time. But the catastrophe that was imminent was prevented, and there was no contamination of the downstream water surfaces in the area.
More than that, when I was attending the two-man oil and gas forum, there were actually two stands opposing. One was about drilling and exploration, and the other was about cleaning. And I've seen some marvelous new materials, especially from the Skokov Foundation, which allow to, I'm not familiar with technical wording, but sort of to separate, I think that would be the word, oil from water without keeping oil on this nano surface and allowing the water to run through. Now, you had to face that calamity, obviously. Were you surprised by the reaction of the society? We're talking about this here. Just until recently, the Russian businesses didn't really think about the environment a lot, except for where they were under the government regulations. This time around, the society reacted.
Well, Sergei, what I cannot agree with you on is that ESG is about moods and atmosphere, but it's not about money. It is about money. It is about business model. It is about new paradigm of development. And this is a sign of the changing external and internal conditions in which successful businesses will be operating in future. This is a demand from the society, demand from various stakeholders, be that consumers of my product, be that my investors, or be that my banks and financial institutions. Mind you, there is an internal audience, which is the population of the cities where we operate, indigenous populations that we take care about, regulators, and so on. So it's a qualitative change in the approach that the society has taken towards large businesses. So we actually welcome that, because there is no future for us if my consumers would say, oh no, I'm not going to buy, Andre, from you, your dirty metal or your dirty gas or oil. Or the financial institutions would say, well, listen, there is this new directive of the European Commission that bans financing of, again, dirty nickel, dirty oil, dirty gas. So again, this is about business model and about money as well.
Could you elaborate on it? Because you've just touched upon the subject which was raised by Lord Barker before that. So I certainly understand why the civil societies demand this or this. Why is business interested in ESG despite it being more costly?
Well, of course, it comes at a certain price, but at the same time, it comes, or it produces totally new quality of production and new culture that is not so widely spread, unfortunately, in Russia. ESG is not about environment. If you look at the ESG ratings, environment takes about 50% of in the scoring model. The rest is related to issues of corporate responsibility and corporate governance, which indeed would be a very important ingredients of the ESG approach. The answer to your question, why the businesses are interested, first of all, because there is no future if you don't do that, you'll be squeezed out of your own traditional markets. Secondly, because there is a new generation of managers and they have a new set of values that puts the preservation of nature really high on their list of priorities. And thirdly, there is a changing mood in the society towards preservation of nature. You cannot ignore that.
Absolutely. Emily Olsen, have you had any strange, for you, twists in your conversations with your Russian counterparts when you raised the subject of this new approach and they failed to comprehend you, or on the contrary?
No, on the contrary. I mean, I think Russia has historically, I mean, if we're not putting it in terms of climate change per se, given it that label, I mean, I think Russia has a long history of taking steps to protect the environment, be it water, forestry, etc. So sustainability is not a new concept in Russia, and it's certainly not one for our partners. As you know, we partner with Rosneft, who has long, they've put out a sustainability report before BP even did, starting in 2006, really being transparent and earmarking their performance and the activities they're doing. And so no, I think it's actually an opportunity. I think it's certainly an opportunity for us to learn from them and for us to share what we're thinking in the long term. And to Andre's point earlier here, I mean, it's the right thing to do. I mean, the impact for the inputs from civil society and investors are part of it, but also for a company like BP, it's part of our DNA. We've always had systematic environmental management and safety core to what we do as a business, and it's good business. And I think where we see the future in Russia, I think there's plenty of opportunities. I mean, from forestry to natural carbon solutions, but efficiencies, energy efficiencies, that our partners certainly have taken a lead on. So I think there is much more positive momentum around this agenda than people might recognize.
I mean, if we go further from the frontage of the BP-Rosneft relationship, does this new approach affect the chain of supplies as well?
Absolutely. I mean, I think supply chains actually, I mean, we spend, in total with our own investments globally, from supply chain to people to operational assets, that's $283 billion we can calculate going into the global economy. I think supply chain is a great area of growth, of optimization. And I do think it's something that we've all in our businesses will be looking at, supply chain, regardless of ESG, is an area that is always looking for optimization. And I think, for BP at least, this will be core to our strategy moving forward, is how do we optimize our own supply chain to be more efficient and more environmentally friendly.
Look, Mark, inevitably during this conversation, I would at some stage use the B word, Brexit.
I thought you were going to be Churchillian for a moment.
Well, Wilsonian, Churchillian, somewhere there. I've had a funny conversation about Brexit this week with some of my Russian friends, who honestly said, wholeheartedly said, that we very much regret Brexit. They represent the nuclear energy sector. Mm. We regret Brexit because once Britain is outside, there's less of lobbying opportunities with the European Commission, because of course the Continentals are so much more skeptical about nuclear energy than the UK. Mm-hmm. Where in fact the nuclear energy is having its second boom, I think we may say so. So how do you envisage further Russian-British cooperation and dialogue regarding what we've been talking about here, when we are Russia and Britain, they are the Europe? I should add in between brackets that there are only two countries in Europe, where when you say Europe, you mean whoever else other than yourselves, and these are Russia and Britain. But coming back to my question, are there new elements in Russian-British commercial cooperation, given that Britain is outside the EU?
Yeah, I mean, I was a cheerleader for Remain and was devastated when the UK took the decision to leave. But
it has happened.
It's happened, and that's democracy. You've got to pick yourself up, dust yourself down, and accept it. And so I'm now looking for the opportunity. Nothing's very rarely are things completely black or completely white. And of course there are positives. And one of the positives that can come out of it is that in the long term, we are, the UK is free to, develop trade in a more nimble way, in a more innovative way than the slow-moving, EU bureaucracy. And while we no longer have the power that comes from being part of a large block that can't be ignored, we have to be more innovative and flexible. And so I hope, even though the bilateral relationship on a political level between Russia and the UK, is clearly very difficult, I hope what most sides can agree on, where we can be positive, is on trade and engagement and investment. You have here two Russian companies quoted on the London Stock Exchange. You've got BP, with a massive investment in Russia and a long-term commitment to that investment. So I think trade and investment is the absolute best place to focus, and to focus for the long-term development. And as I say, I think if I'm optimistic that things will improve, and we're in the right place for that to happen.
Let me come back to my question once again. Maybe I articulated it in such a way that you went to be political now, but I was talking about the ESG culture. Will it be affected by the UK leaving the EU as far as the UK-Russian commercial engagement is concerned?
No. I mean, the ESG culture is being, as I said in my sort of earlier answer, is being driven primarily by investors. And I think London, as a global capital centre, which is far more important than the rest of the European financial centres put together, London is still the destination of choice for certainly for Russian quoted companies and as a centre for financing. But London is also rapidly emerging as the global go-to place for another form of innovative financial products, namely green finance and green investment. And I think that whole ESG agenda is nowhere more alive than in the London capital markets. So I think, if anything, London's probably going to seek to differentiate itself by being more on these ESG issues than perhaps some of the more slower to move, less developed capital markets in Europe. So no, I think if anything, ESG is going to be driven forward. And if you look at some of the commitments that the UK is taking post-Brexit, we're going to be hosting the UN COP26 climate talks next year. And this is a real chance for Boris Johnson's government to show that post-Brexit, the UK is still a progressive force in the world and is a player on the global stage. And that's why I think they are, really doubling down on the climate agenda. And if you look at some of the statements that the Johnson government is making, they are going above and beyond what the rest of the EU is doing on climate. And historically, over the last decade, the UK was always at the forefront of pushing the EU to be more progressive on the climate change agenda. I was involved in that myself. So if anything, I think the UK is going to emerge as a climate and ESG more broadly leader.
Now that you have mentioned it, I think we must, all of us, collectively greet the former Britannic Majesty's ambassador to Russia, Laurie Bristow, who's now the UK ambassador in charge of the forthcoming Glasgow event.
Indeed. And what's also really important to say is that conference will not be a success unless, Russia is fully engaged. And the great news is Russia is. I was at the UN when the presidential climate envoy announced that Russia was ratifying Paris Agreement. And I'm really encouraged by the interest that there is amongst the Russian business sector in this whole agenda. And and I think if the Russian science base, Russia has this extraordinary depth in research and development. If that shifts and pivots more towards the green economy, it's going to become a very important player indeed. And given the natural resources across the Russian Federation, there is the fundamental potential for Russia to be a clean energy superpower. And just as important in the global energy economy as it is in hydrocarbons.
Pavel, you are, of course, the general manager for Russia, Belarus, and Armenia. So let me now switch from the EU-related subjects to the Eurasian Union-related subjects. What about the ESG, the understanding of the ESG in those other countries of which you're in charge?
Well, as far as I understand, English is our language now, so no problem at all. Thanks, Sergey, for the question.
I was obliged, I was trying to be the other European, but they didn't allow me to.
In terms of other countries, so they are quite new markets for us for Greco. We've done a little bit of work in Belarus, just bits and pieces. Haven't done well. We did see customers. Potential customers in Armenia. So I can only probably speak a little bit about Belarus, and I can tell that ecology
be careful.
And environment are also important to the customers there in the end of the day when it comes to us. Though even like in Russia these days, we talk about ecology and environment. We don't talk about the concept of ESG. We are not being asked, are you guys compliant? Do you have a strategy? We right away when we go and talk to customers, we just say that those are our cornerstones, and it's important that we adhere to those standards. It's important for us, and we understand that it's important to the customers. So I would say it's just nothing very much different in those two other countries, in Armenia and Belarus versus Russia, though I would say that it's not something which is in 100% focus for the customers at this point of time.
Does it depend on the average income, by the way? The understanding of ESG, the demand for ESG from the society?
Well, I'm sure we can find a correlation there. But it's really, in the end of the day, I think generally and globally, as you mentioned in the beginning, and ask from the society, from younger generation included, and that's driving that up the chain in companies. It's driving up the chain in governments. And I can tell that you can feel that it is important in the end of the day.
Andrei Bugrov, are we at a stage where the ESG is readily accepted by larger companies, big corporations, but still an unknown subject for small and medium-sized businesses?
Well, I would agree, because the smaller companies, medium-sized and small businesses, they cannot, in many cases, simply cannot afford the luxury of proper ESG models. So at the moment, as far as the Russian market is concerned, it is mostly amongst the big Russian corporates that they change according to ESG matrix. But mind you, part of the ESG matrix is, this is the question that you asked, is to see whether there is a similarity.
Andrei, we've lost you, I'm afraid. We can't hear you.
Ensure that all our partners that supply whatever they supply, they have the same ideology, the same approach, and they have the same internal regulations. So this is, to me, a source of hope and inspiration that this ESG approach would be more widely spread as time goes on.
Right. Let me ask the organizers at this stage if we have questions from the audience. I'm afraid I can't see it on my screen, but I understand that by this time we must have some. Are there any? Are the organizers hearing me?
Yes, Sergey, one should be coming to you now, if you just stand by.
It's an old Russian and English habit to stand by, so we're fine.
Yes. Have you got it? It's on your screen. It's in the chat. Shall I read it out, or do you want to, Sergey?
Please read it out, rather.
Okay,
I can't see it on my screen.
Fine, sorry. Okay. It's a question from Jose Fabian, and he's asking, might it be necessary to additionally consider a thermodynamic perspective on sustainability, to not only consider the cleanliness of the source, but also if a clean but non-renewable source may generate thermal pollution that could harm the Earth's natural heat sinks? Quite a technical question, but interesting one nonetheless.
Well, it's also a philosophical one, so I think we should start with Lord Barker, who's had an experience of dealing with government policies regarding this year.
Well, goodness me. I was just about to fiddle with my computer and claim that there was an interruption in the line. Well, I'm really not. I have to say, I'm not completely sure I fully grasp the question. Actually, I thought I did it in the first part. But so what he's saying is, should we look at the whole?
Yes. Might it be necessary to additionally consider a thermodynamic perspective on sustainability?
Yeah, I have to put my hand up and say I've never had that question before. Is there anyone else on the panel with a bigger, perhaps Emily,
Emily, yes, you've been smiling, so go ahead.
I was quite grateful Lord Barker stepped into that one, as I am not an engineer. But I mean, in broad brush strokes here, I think every element of sustainability will be looked at. And as companies, particularly natural resource companies, extractive companies, you dive deeper into this sustainability agenda. I think everything's on the table. I think it will evolve. I mean, as I mentioned before, 12 years ago, I had a portfolio within BP that was renewables and sustainability, right? And how much we have evolved, how much technology has evolved, how we approach and look at sustainability has just changed exponentially. And so, on the thermal aspect, I think I would just offer, technology will be a huge player, and it will unlock a lot of how we think and act around sustainability. And I think, looking at sustainability holistically in every element will become very much part of our business as usual
As we've heard about holistically, let me come back to the... Oh, yes, Andrei, go ahead. Yes.
Let me add to that in fact, the ESG matrix includes the sort of thermodynamic dimension in this, because the matrix looks at the usage of renewable sources of energy. The rating agencies monitor the plans to increase the utilization of such clean sources of energy. And in fact, I understand the temptation to expand the ESG sort of universe. There are much more letters in the alphabet to be added. The World Economic Forum has just added letter D, data, to ESG, meaning that there are risks involved in data analysis, data collection, and this all boils down to cyber risks that have to be monitored, and they want to assess the ability of the companies to mitigate that risk. So one could easily expect that there'll be other dimensions in this equation.
Okay, I've got a story to tell and a question for all of you. I personally came across this subject about 25 years ago when I was invited to visit some of the oil and gas facilities in the United States. I went there with a delegation of Russian oilers and gas producers in charge of the environment. So I remember vividly two things which struck me back then. First was the Trans-Alaskan Pipeline map. As you may know, there's the same thing on the Russian railway from Moscow to St. Petersburg. There's a little twist there, suddenly. So the anecdote goes like, Tsar was using the map in a liner to put the route of the railway. Then suddenly he trembled, and since then we have this little curve on the railway running from Moscow to St. Petersburg. Now there's the same curve on the Trans-Alaskan Pipeline. So when I saw it, my first association was with the Moscow-St. Petersburg railway. But as it happens, when the pipeline was being constructed 30 or 40 years ago, they found a nest of that very eagle from the American coat of arms there, and they decided to make a bit of a diversion, which is a very lovely, lively example of how careful we could be with the nature, especially there in the north. However, the second thing, which I still remember from that trip in 1994, was when we were welcomed by, I think it was a BP official, in fact. Does BP operate in the Channel Islands area of California? I think it does. Well, I may be mistaken here. It doesn't actually matter. But that's official from the oil company. Started explaining the results of its work in that area. And suddenly, very surprisingly for the Russian audience, which was at the height of the capital exchanges back then, he started calculating results and successes, not in GDP per capita, not in US dollars, not in investment terms, but in the number of jobs created, which was a strange logic for the Russians who were just out of communism and, you know, enjoying the first stages of capitalism. But this criterion rather, of creating jobs could be part of ESG as well, if you think about it. The question for you, the question which worries me, really, I'm not exaggerating here, who should articulate such goals? Must it be national governments, international organizations, other than the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, corporations? Who? Because we're talking here about a balance between the interest of corporations, societies, and things on the ground.
If I may, having messed up on the last question, I might try and recover myself on this one. I think the UN actually is the place that this starts, and the Sustainable Development Goals really have gained momentum. We at N+ are signed up as a member of the UN Global Compact, which is companies which right the way around the world have committed to report against the Sustainable Development Goals. But even those who haven't signed up, I think there is certainly amongst large companies around the world, the SDGs are the gold standard. And then from that, there are a whole number of sustainable development metrics that go for everything from climate to environmental in the broader sense, and also to welfare standards that flow from those SDGs. So I think the work of the UN on this is not to be dismissed or taken lightly. I think it's the right place. I think they, broadly speaking, have got the right issues. And there is a danger if you articulate too many goals, too many targets, and it just becomes a blizzard of undertakings that everything gets lost. So I'm a big fan of the Sustainable Development Goals, and you'll see that embedded in the N+ Group Sustainability Report. And sustainability reporting is a very new science, but it's extraordinary to see now the detail and science which is behind it. And we are by no means alone in that. In fact, we're only in our second year of reporting properly on sustainability. But when I started life at the end of the 80s as a stock market analyst, sustainability or reporting was in one paragraph at the back of an annual report, if you were lucky. The EN+, we're not there yet in terms of being completely comprehensive, but it's a 200-page standalone document that takes a whole team of experts and professionals in our company, several months to put together. And it makes for much better, more effective business as a result. So, big shout out to the Sustainable Development Goals.
Anyone else? We've got a minute and a half left.
May I add to that? Because contrary to Lord Barker, I have some sophisticated skepticism about the efficiency and ability of the United Nations to, particularly in such an area. There is no common standard methodology for ESG, and the search for that is going on. And one of the milestones in that is the recent report by 4 major auditor companies. It's called Measuring Stakeholder Capitalism Towards Common Matrix and Consistent Reporting on Sustainable Value Creation. It's done by Deloitte, Ernst & Young, KPMG, and PwC. And there was a big steering committee led by Chairman of the Bank of America, Brian Moynihan. This is a good source and the starting point for common methodology.
We have about 30 seconds left. We actually have about a minute left. So
could I just say I completely agree with Andre, and don't get me wrong, the SDGs are not perfect. I'm very much work in progress, and in order to be meaningful, you do need rigorous metrics and common standards, and that's very much a work in progress. So I completely agree with Andre.
Well, to this I can say that someone who was born Russian, has maintained close links with the UK for the last 25 years, but grew up in Latin America. Let me assure you that this conversation today is very interesting and fruitful and thoughtful for the 4 people involved here, the 5. But it's less than comprehensible for a lot of people who live in the developing world. But that's a subject for another discussion. But it's important, given the UN agenda and given the capabilities of those countries there. Anyway, thank you so much indeed. We've been super punctual. It's 12:55 Moscow time, 10:55 London time. We've run out of our 55 minutes. I just thank everyone who's participated. Bark, Andrei Bugrov, Emily Olsen, Pavel Yakushev, excuse me. And the floor is given now to the RBCC's next session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sergey.
Thank you.
Thank you.